Graham St. John, PhD, is a cultural anthropologist and historian of transformational events, movements, and figures. His forthcoming book, Strange Attractor, The Hallucinatory Life of Terence McKenna, published by the MIT Press this September 30th, is the latest among his 10 books, which also include Mystery School in Hyperspace, A Cultural History of DMT, published by North Atlantic Books in 2015. Graham is Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Media, Humanities, and Arts at the University of Huddersfield, United Kingdom. Graham, welcome to the Brain Forest Cafe.
Thank you, Dennis. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have you. I can't tell you how much I've looked forward to this. So, how would you like to structure this? I have some ideas, but what would you like to discuss?
Oh, I'm happy for you to structure this in the way you like. I mean, you being, the reader. So
Well,
I'm happy to do that
that's
way.
true. I am the reader, I guess also am the participant. Well, I reread your preface and your introduction, and you talked about some of the experiences that Terence and I shared in our early life. And then after he left Paonia for Berkeley, we were still very much involved with each other for the rest of his life. The 1970s were really the decade of probably our most intense involvement with each other, besides the growing up together and all of that. And when Terence was in high school, I was still in touch and frequently would see him. But then later in that decade, at the end of that decade, I started my graduate work in ethnopharmacology at the University of British Columbia in 1979, and I went to the Amazon. Well, I've eluded maybe the most important event of the 1970s, which is our trip to La Chirera, in 1971, and I was a junior in college. I was an undergraduate at the time, but I dropped out of school to take that trip. And that, of course, brought the mushrooms into our lives for the first time.
So
And
can I just step in just for a second here, Dennis, because I think you're getting up to that point there. We're in the early '80s
right,
when Terence tried to get you to go back to La Chirera.
right,
Essentially from
exactly.
that sort of moment that your lives kind of diverged a lot more.
Exactly. When we did go back to the Amazon, this time in Peru, I was there as an ethnobotanist, and I really wanted to focus on ethnobotany. Terence wanted to, replicate the experiment at La Chirera, and I wasn't having any of it. It was like, no, I'm not here to do that. And he was only with me and with my colleagues for a few weeks in 1981. But then, the decade of the 1980s unfolded, and I continued my graduate work and so on, and Terence continued what he was doing. And it's not that we weren't involved with each other. We very much were, but there was a distancing in a certain way. I could see these trajectories of our lives kind of splitting at that point, separating. I had my interest in botany and ethnopharmacology, and Terence was more interested in what you might call metaphysics and psychedelic exploration. I was not uninterested in those things, but one of the effects of the experiment and the experience at La Chirera, after it was all over, well, it's never been all over because we've lived in the shadow of La Chirera forever and continue to do so. But after the return, Terence expressed the position that science will never explain this, what happened to us, and we should reject science. And I was saying, well, wait a minute, we're not really scientists. We need to learn how to do science first. Then we can reject it, keeping in mind the limitations of science, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There is value in science. So I cleaved. I felt like I had to learn to do science. And that's why I focused on all these relatively hardcore disciplines like chemistry and pharmacology. And Terence, by that time, had more or less rejected academia. He didn't have those aspirations. And and I think we shared an understanding that exploration of these edges of reality and understanding certainly delineates the limitations of scientific knowledge. It very much makes that clear, but that doesn't mean it's worthless, you know? And not that he said it was worthless, but you know what I mean. He was quick to dismiss it. It was like, well, let's get on with it. And I was like, well, I have to do some science, and I did.
I suppose it his resistance to science is just mixed in with his rebellion against all authority, whether religion or political, academic, celebrities, all forms of and that also leads into the ambivalence with his own sense of authority, his own leadership, and his own sort of unwillingness to or reluctance to take a leadership role, which I think is quite evident and is a subject of a couple of the chapters in there. His ambivalence with authority.
Yes, not only his ambivalence about authority, I mean, it was sort of a rejection, but also a sense that there was a certain messianic cast to, our that grew out of our experiences at La Churera. I think he felt that he was hearing a higher authority. You know, he was in touch with some at times during his life, he called it the logos, and he assumed that that was coming from the mushroom in some ways, and perhaps it was. I mean, this was something that he looked to, and he felt that there were, and then it's like as you describe it in the book, Terence was had uh I guess connection with at least two different founts of wisdom or sources of wisdom as he developed his thinking. One was the logos, the logos, the coming from the mushrooms, the idea that you're in touch with, this intelligent entity that is dispensing wisdom or at least advice. And then the other one is the elf machine population of the DMT space, which is not a place that despite what people like to think, he didn't go there that often. He went there often enough to appreciate it. He was terrified of it in some ways, and perhaps with good reason. I mean, I found it a challenging experience also. But there were these two things that were really more than all of his reading and everything else that really shaped his understanding. It was like those were the lenses through which he viewed and constructed his model of reality and his understanding of what was going on. You think that's a fair way to put it?
Yeah, yeah, and he resisted other methods of transpersonality and the paranormal. I mean, um, any method that didn't involve essentially tryptamines, psychoactive tryptamines, was belittled, and it wasn't authentic, wasn't the real thing, and and he I guess through his career as a spokesperson, especially at Esalen, became a seminal figure who held fast to that position. And but yet he also had, throughout his life, he pursued his opus, which was the time wave, which was ever present in every rap he gave. Which, as every rap was never the same. The story was never the same. It might have been regurgitated in different ways, um, but in every spoken word performance, the time wave was ever present.
Yeah.
And I just come back from a Zora festival where I spoke a little bit about that, and um, how um, you know how seminal that was, and but that the typical approach to the time wave is to attempt to understand it as an algorithmic thing, as opposed to what I think is more readily apparent, and that is that it's more of a mythopoetic um, construct. It's more of a myth. It's more mythical than mathematical. If you to make sense of it, I think it is
It
is a myth more than a
it
mathematical construct.
works better as a myth. It's effective as a myth. It's not so it's not so effective as an algorithm. I mean, it's interesting, about how personal to me it's interesting how to me how personal it was. The time wave is as much a reflection of Terence's understanding of time and history than anything else. I mean, the events that he identified as pivotal, as transformative in the time wave were events that he was very much involved with, very interested in, and not necessarily the pivotal events. Terrence and I used to have, I don't know if you'd call them arguments, but lively discussions about the time wave when many of them in that loft on Tunnel Road. We would sit around and smoke hash and discuss this. And my position was that the problem with the time wave is it could not be disproven. And so in a sense, it wasn't a theory. It was a postulate. It was a beautiful construct. It was very interesting from many perspectives, mathematical and in terms of a novel way of looking at the I Ching and all of this, but it was not, could not be a map of time, and it certainly couldn't be proven. That the tricky part with the time wave was always, where do you put the end date? And built into the very structure of the time wave was there had to be an end date. And eventually he settled on December 21st, 2012, which of course he assumed that he would be around to witness, and sadly he wasn't. But for various reasons, as you well document in the book, there were various end dates proposed during the evolution of the time wave. Finally, that was the one. And felt I felt that in some ways the time wave, although it was uniquely from Terence and a construct of his mind, I think in some ways it distracted from other things about his thinking that were perhaps more valid, in some ways, more interesting. The time wave could be, uh, I think that later in life, in the 90s, and particularly when Watson showed up at Palenque and basically criticized the time wave in a way that was very hard to respond to. he began to lose faith in the time wave. I don't know if faith is the right word, but he began to have doubts about it. And I'd always been skeptical about it, and I think he was beginning to understand my reservations. And it's unfortunately when Watson came along and gave it this mathematical analysis and basically demolished the theoretical foundations. Terence did not honestly try to respond to those criticisms. He kind of turned the fan base loose on poor Watson, and they piled on. And and there was not any attempt to let's step back from it a bit, and let's try and understand what Watson is saying, and can that be rectified? Is there a way to save the time wave? Uh, that attempt wasn't made.
Yeah. But yet, right through to the end, right through to his final, recorded conversations, it was still ever present. And one thing that I did note in the book is that he did have trouble kind of sharing the mantle with figures that he would class as squirrels, like the squirrels from LA and the Mayan calendar crowd, and specific individuals there who he whose ideas he rejected. But he did maintain, and I guess this is why he, the word prophet has been, cast at his feet, in his life and posthumously, that that he independently arrived at that date. And it was astounding, always astounding for him to even contemplate that he'd done so, um, or that more to the point that the mushroom divulged the date to him, because of
Right,
course that was the ultimate explanation,
right,
that it
right.
was the mushroom muse that provided him with that information.
But the mushroom divulged various dates through the course of a time wave, and there was a revision, each time revisionism, uh, and eventually, he settled on the December 21st, 2012 date, which made a lot of sense in a certain way because of the relation to the Mayan calendar and this sort of thing. But it was not that was not the initial date. And and it was another thing about it, it was comfortably in the future. There were various dates that were postulated in the 70s, in the 80s. Those dates came and went, and that did not help the validity of the time wave. So finally, I think part of his thinking was, let's put it at a future date that basically may it may be more easy to defend. And I think but his interests were not confined to the time wave. The time wave is a unique, whatever you want to call it, a statistical construct, an alchemical object, an algorithm, something. I mean,
A
I think
puzzle garden,
what's that?
a puzzle garden
Uh, yeah, a
was one
puzzle.
of the many metaphors
What?
used. Yeah. But yeah, but I mean, I'm sure someone will come along at some point and do a project exclusively on the time wave, and that's not what my book is. I have one chapter on that, and there may be, because I continue to work on a biographical work. I mean, this is the first output. This book is the first output of a longer project. But I'm sure that someone that others will excavate the time wave in ways that I haven't, and ask questions like, well, if this was so, if this opus was so central to his life, then how come it didn't predict his own end? Questions like that could arise.
Another good question. Right, right. Yeah,
And how come, because he left us just a year before events started to really roll, such as, I think September the 11th
right.
was in the following year. And in fact, I think he had an interview um, with someone near the World Trade Towers was probably 19, I think it was early 2000. I figure his name I can't recall, but he did do an interview, and there was no inkling that within a year or so, I mean, that there would have there should have been some serious zeros being pulled on those charts,
Hmm.
if this was if these were charts that predicted change,
Right, right.
significant changes.
Yeah, you look at various aspects of it, and it's clear from, and conceptually, that it couldn't possibly be a map of time. It just didn't work. For one thing, it took no account of relativity and the relativity of time, and time. The idea was that this applied to all times in all places, and the universe doesn't really work that way. So
And
that was
yet,
a major misunderstanding, which people pointed out.
and yet, the underlying theory of what he at one stage called compressionism, which was a concept that he didn't persist with, but in conversations with Rupert Sheldrake and Rolf Abraham,
Right.
came up with this concept of compressionism, which dealt with co- complexification and acceleration, and these are ideas that still hold their own in a certain sense, and given how things have developed in the last 25 years, I suspect that he he would, if he was a true revenant who returned, then he might say that we were in I told you so country.
He would say, "What?"
He might say that we were in I told you so country,
Right, right. Uh, ex
regardless of the specifics about particular end dates.
right. And that's a good point, because in some way, from a broader perspective, the time wave and Terence's entire preoccupation with the end times and with transformation, both self-transformation and transformation of the culture, uh in that sense, he was right, it seems like. I mean, as we've seen in the, in the two 25 years since 2000, we've seen all of these changes take place, and things seem to be going in a very peculiar direction, it seems to me, and not I mean, it's hard to know the way that history is unfolding. It does seem to be headed in the direction of some sort of pivotal transformational event. He talked about uh the transcendental object at the end of time. And in a certain sense, I think he probably had that intuition is probably right. And I think we may have reached a point where maybe we know what the transcendental object at the end of time is, but it's not what we think it is. It's not what we hoped it is. My own perspective on this, as I look at what's happening in the world, is that the transcendental object at the end of time may be AI. And AI may, people worry, is it the end of humanity? Potentially, I think it is, because what we're doing is outsourcing our spirit. And Terence talked about the exteriorization of the spirit. He was very preoccupied with this notion that, the spirit, this liberated, angelic instantiation of the exteriorized spirit, it's something you engineer, it's something you build, with psychedelics or various things, but it's actually an artifact in a certain way. But the way that he was an always the optimist and always aspirational, and the way he discussed it, this liberation of the spirit from matter, or the projection of spirit onto matter, was always discussed in a very optimistic way, as a salvation, as some sort of angelic metamorphosis. You don't see that with AI. AI is extremely, at least to my mind, it's extremely, the direction it seems to be leading us is quite dark and quite terrifying, to frankly. And to my perspective, and my perspective being also perhaps the perspective of an old man, whose day is done. Uh, I can't change what's happening. Uh, I'm along for the ride along with everyone else, but what seems to be happening is, on the geopolitical front, on uh, the rise of AI, on the ecological front, the collapse of planetary ecosystems, the outsourcing of our minds, our creativity to AI, the apparently the world is well along toward dividing up into different authoritarian spheres of influence, and these things are what is shaping the world right now. And compassion and decency doesn't seem to be a big part of it. It's more about
Right.
power and dominance.
So, I mean, uh, I'm just a biographer. I don't tend to make. I'm not a prognostician, but the interesting thing about, as you know, about Terence is his was so unique in that, in all of intellectual history, because he was such a his voice was his art form, and he was, and is, frankly, remains a unique oratory intellect who's left us with this vast archive of spoken word performances. It's quite unparalleled in the depth and the breadth of this content that was recorded over, as you know, over about 3 decades. And in fact, I think I know that the oldest recording goes back to is 1972, which is um, uh, a recording that was made privately by Thomas Starr in San Francisco apartment about a year after La Chorrera, and it's about 3 hours of that, and it hasn't been released before, but it will soon be released. Um, in fact, just before my book's published, we'll release it in conjunction with a video sync that's being created by Peter Bergman, and I'll also write an essay, which is an essay about his distinct oratory intellect, and how his rap is really reflects the immediacy of his performance. And the reason I bring that up in relation to what you're talking about is, uh, in recent times we've seen um, people generate models, um, large language models based on Terrence's voice that is these bizarre spectral reanimations of Terence with
Right.
using voice simulators as well that are based on uh, well over 300 hours of Terence's public uh, pronouncements on a vast range of uh, matter. And so just in terms of how Terence left in us in the year 2000. He left at a time when the internet was just starting to rock,
Right.
and in many respects, he um, he didn't really leave us. And you know, a- as I mean, he's probably one of the most bizarre examples of um, a figure who's perpetually departing while always arriving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that makes him, just from a biographer's point of view, um, a a uh, a fascinating spectral phenomenon, because here is a figure who is performing the role essentially of the logos for multitudes of people, whether it's his voice in electronic music tracks, because I mean we're talking about the most sampled individual in history of electronic music, and this is going back to the early 90s, before he died. So this was years before he was already a disembodied voice,
Right.
and
Right.
has continued to be that disembodied voice that uh, performs in many ways like a what I call a meta trip sitter. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in terms of when you consider that his voice appears in 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 the in sampled in music that appears in heightened states of people's lives on dance floors around the world or in their own lounge rooms
Mm-hmm.
when they're in altered states. And so a an amazing spectral phenomenon.
Right. Right. I agree. His perpetual cyber immortality, or his perpetual presence on the internet, you know, is a big factor in shaping the sort of cultural meme we uh that we encounter when we're thinking about the future. But Terrence was totally oriented toward the future, obviously, because of the time wave. He was looking ahead at this postulated end date. But do you think, I mean, and we've reached a point now where all of these different trends seem to be coming together. AI, planetary ecological collapse, and the rise of authoritarianism and fascism the world over. The picture is pretty dystopian when you think about it. Uh, do you think Terence ever anticipated that aspect of it? Because his vision was redemptive. His vision was about the transition out of history into some sort of ahistorical or non-historical paradisical state, like Iliade talked about. Uh, what do you think he would have said? How do you? I mean, I have not. I have to admit, I haven't looked into any of the Terence chatbots or any of the AI simulations of him because I'm well, I have this innate sort of reservation about AI in general, but I also think that no AI could possibly could provide a a realistic simulation of Terence's thought because it's too complex. It could repeat
Right.
and mix and put things together that he said, but it can't simulate Terence. There's only
Well,
one.
it's interesting because um, I've been given privileged access to experiment with an app that's being developed that is called Eschaton, and that may be available as a freemium release, as they say, in the next months, which is and this is a project that Lorenzo Haggerty has been involved with, or at least the model is based on um, his podcasts, and that's I don't know. I think they were saying something like 60 gigs of content, hundreds of hours of Terence's spoken word stuff. But and I've tested that, and it's pretty vintage Terence. It's quite a remarkable advent as a basically an oracle, a Terence oracle that you have on your phone. But you're right. I mean, I mean, it's obviously it's not Terence, and these recordings weren't. So this is based on Terence's public performances. These aren't
Right.
Terence's private thoughts or based on his personal musings in private. So there's that, and then there's also, you know, because as we know, one of the primary traits that Terence had was his humor and his wicked sense of humor,
Right.
and that's impossible to
Right.
replicate.
No AI can simulate that. That's exactly right. And with all due respect to Lorenzo's efforts, which, I respect, I know it's a lot of work, but inevitably the material that he has to work with is vintage, because that's what there is. And then you try to reformulate that, repurpose that into some sort of contemporary instantiation of the Terence persona, whatever it is doomed to failure, in a certain way. Although
I must say that when I asked I was going to say it when I asked him, Terrence, about what he thinks about Donald Trump, I have to say that their response was pretty interesting. Um,
really, what did he
oh,
say?
I imagine that when this comes out, you might have a bit of a laugh, and but you might also find it somewhat insightful. I mean, I haven't experimented with it in depth. I don't know how that's being released, but it is a fascinating concept, and I did explore that recently when I was working on an article about Terence's cybernetic reanimation, which is a whole other project and may be the subject of more writing down the line, but it's not really a subject that I take up to any great extent in the biography. And can I say that this project, I mean, I have so many. I mean, you've read the acknowledgements section of my book, which is like a minor thesis in its own right.
Yes, I have.
And
Not memorized all of it,
I
but
could
yes.
never have undertaken a project like this without the support and assistance of a great many people.
Right.
And
Testimony to the thoroughness
I,
of your work, you know?
and I don't intend to name all those people now,
Right, of
but
course.
it's a huge undertaking, and I had the distinct pleasure of having the support of so many people, including yourself, and bending over backwards to assist me and point me in various directions and link me up with key characters such as the late Rick Watson, who left us a year ago now or
Right,
more.
right,
And I mean, he was just so pivotal to my project. He was the first person that I interviewed, in London in 2018, and it all sort of snowballed from there. And Rick being the guy who supplied Terence with the DMT that he got the elves visiting him in February 1966.
right. And they also shared this interesting morning glory seed experiment, which would be 1964. That was really, from the description, that was really Terrence's, I mean, it was effective. It was Terrence's and Rick's first real psychedelic experience. Terrence had played with morning glory seeds in Paonia a little bit and had some minor effects, but the morning glory trip in Golden Gate Park and then at the City Lights Books, that was a real trip, and that was my opener for them. One thing it one thing that had come up to me in when you were discussing, maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but when you were discussing Terrence's experience at Mountain View High School or AWALT High School, there was Rick and all of these characters, and another key figure there was John Parker,
Right.
which you don't say much about. I think he gets a paragraph in the whole book. I think he was quite influential, maybe not as much as Rick, but they were kind of a triad. They got into a lot of mischief together, and John Parker was also he was a unique and amazing figure like Terence, and but in a different way. I think there was a much darker aspect to him. His father also was, a brilliant chemist at NASA Ames, and but in lots of ways not a good person. I mean, John's girlfriend, Barbara, uh, became for a while my girlfriend in Boulder when around 1969. In fact, she basically was my first serious lover, and John bequeathed her or introduced her to me, knowing what would happen. John visited us in Paonia when on summer vacation when Terence was in Berkeley. One summer, John came back and I was there, and he took a shine to me, and kind of adopted me he became a mentor to me. I think he was bisexual. I think he had some kind of, maybe sexual impulse and toward me, but it was never expressed, and I learned a great deal from him. We corresponded extensive letters over almost a decade. We talked about this lost correspondence that his son may have. But I was just surprised that there was less about him in the biography, considering how important Rick was. And maybe it's because you didn't have the material.
Yeah, it is.
Don was gone.
I think largely because I don't have the material, but I think there's more than a paragraph. But I did also mention there that I think this is based on a letter that you'd written to Terence that is in the in the Purdue archives, where you hailed John Parker as a formative influence on the hypercarbylation
Yes,
theory
yes,
that emerged at La Chorrera.
that's right. And actually, John and his father were a formative influence. It was really his father who came up with the idea, or who proposed this crazy idea that, these molecules could intercalate into DNA and then sort of radiate this superconducting signal. I mean, and actually when the Invisible Landscape came out and we came up with this theory, John was like very dismissive. It's like, oh yeah, we talked about this years ago. You guys completely ripped this off from my dad. Not quite, but there was that element. I mean, had John had a more prolific output in terms of, he was not really in the public eye. In fact, he was almost pathologically introverted and covert and very much, into the occult and staying in the shadows. Had there been more material, I mean, he would make a great figure for a similar biography. But of course, he didn't have the cultural recognition and iconic recognition that
Well,
Terence.
you have to dig up those letters. I think that's probably going to be instrumental to any further sort of knowledge on that. But it did interest me that he had an interest in joining the trip to South America initially. I think he wanted to go
Mhm.
through Mexico,
Right.
and and so I'm sure that his presence there would have changed the mix
Oh, it would have
considerably.
absolutely changed the mix. Yeah, yeah. But anyway, so many interesting people in Terence's life, and you talk about this, very elegantly and eloquently, people that we knew in Paonia. I mean, considering this town, Paonia, basically a coal mining, fruit growing town, and, the biggest community events are the Friday night football games, but there were some of the weirdest people I've ever met in that town, including myself. I mean, and like Ron Curry, for example, he was an athlete. He was all very much, in the high school scene. His dad was a coach, but Ron was a really weird dude, which is why we got along with him, and I used to say there's something in the water or something that, mutates people from Paonia. And then, of course, when Terence finally escaped, from Paonia, did this thing, managed to uh, create all this anxiety on my parents' part about Chris Hutchins and his involvement with Chris Hutchins. I don't know if you know, maybe I shouldn't even say it, but I recently learned she lived in Paonia all of her life. I don't know what her life was like, but she was killed in an automobile accident not too
Yeah,
long ago, 2 or 3 years ago.
right. I know that. Yeah, I mentioned that in the book in Emma.
Do
Yes.
you? You
Yeah.
mentioned? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, I do think that Chris, and of course I knew Chris. I mean, she was an attractive young lady and very smart. She was nerdy like Terrence. I don't know if they ever even consummated their relationship, but they were definitely involved. And my parents were, of course, very, with all the repression of sexuality and being Catholic and all that, he was just afraid that he would knock her up. And whether that was even a risk or not, he played that card to get himself out of Paonia, as well as, I mean, making out in the graveyard. I mean, that was nothing. There was really nothing out of line. Everybody did that. Bethlehem Cemetery was a great place to go neck, I did it myself. Not that I had many girlfriends at Paonia, but, it was not an uncommon thing. But Terence sort of leveraged that, whether deliberately or not, so that my parents thought, we got to get him out of here before something like that happens. And we just happened to have these relatives, close relatives in Menlo Park. They were both school teachers and highly respected by us, at the time. Later, the relationships soured. So then they sent him to California for his junior year, and he fell in with all of these, you know, whatever we did, whatever my parents had imagined he might get into in Paonia, whatever mischief he might get into, it was exponentially enhanced when he went to, uh, to Awald High, to Mountain View, and fell in with these people who were also brilliant, quirky rebels and just amazing, like Rick Watson and Doug Hansen. And I knew most of these people because, I would make visits to Berkeley. I mean, I was in Berkeley. The 2894 Telegraph House was very much a going concern when I went to Berkeley in 1967 with my friend Bob Peake, who was, part of my cartel, if you will, or my circle of druggies, stoners at the time. And 2894 was Terrence, as your book makes clear, he was living up on Tuttle Road at the time, but the salon at 2894 was very active, and I was in on many of those sessions when I was out in the summer, and it was an amazing, amazing thing. I think it was during one of those sessions where Terence said to me something like, "The Philosopher's Stone? I know what the Philosopher's Stone in. There's a jar of it over here on the shelf."
Right, yes.
And it was TMT, and it may well be the Philosopher's Stone.
So just so that the listeners understand what we're talking about. So there was a period for 2 years that Terence leased a house on Telegraph Avenue, and it was basically a rooming house where his fellow students took up rooms. So he was essentially the leasee,
Yes.
and he lived there from in so that he took out that lease in 1965 at the start of his term at UC Berkeley in the experimental college. And so for the first year of that 2 years at the experimental college, he lived there. And he lived there in the master bedroom. I think it was the corner room of the house, and that was where he would hold nightly, meetings. And he had a television set, or maybe he had a television set later, but um, he held court there, and that was where he got the elves. And but after a year or so, I think he decided that he would maintain the lease there and move out to Tunnel Road
Mhm.
for a quieter time. And I think that's where he finished his. Um, he, that's where he finished the second year of the experimental college, and he produced a thesis there. And from there he went overseas the first time. But yeah, that this was a it this was a situation that you hadn't in your memoirs fleshed out. You hadn't fleshed out exactly what he was doing at that stage in terms of where he was living. And this only really came about through talking to a lot of people, and Rick Watson was really instrumental there. And there was a whole bunch of other people even before he moved in to Telegraph Avenue. People like Nina Wise, who a really important figure that he met, and who was also a very close friend of Kat Harrison's.
Right,
In
right.
fact, she was kind of instrumental
In fact,
in those
introduced
guys
Kat
meeting.
to Terence, did she not?
Yeah,
Nina
and
Wise and Kat were students at UC Santa Cruz. I think Kat met Terence through Nina. I'm not sure. Well, you
yeah, it's
documented.
true. Yeah.
Nina's still around, of course. I
Mm.
understand she is. Yeah,
And I mean, just lots of little details. Like she introduced me to a newsletter that was produced by not by a Walt High School, but Los Altos High School, where Nina was a student, and um, there was this mimeograph newsletter that was produced, and a, she has one of those that I've seen a copy of, and we see Terence's name, Terry McKenna listed in the as one of the editors.
right.
Um, Precisely what he did in this newsletter, which I believe was called
Neo
uh,
Etudiant.
say that again.
It was called the Neo Etudiant
That's it.
newsfeed,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah.
don't know what he did, but I know he was affiliated, and they just wanted him on the editorial board because he was, such a raconteur and wordsmith and all that. I mean, he was a perfect fit. I saw some of those issues. I don't recollect. I mean, what they were publishing was kind of the typical, polemics, political and otherwise. I'm not sure what led the school to shut it down. It only lasted a few months and the school shut it down. I'm not sure why they shut it down. I suspect it just was because it was you know, too avant-garde or too heretical for they just didn't approve. They frowned on it. They shut it down.
It's interesting
Didn't
that they
help Terence's attitude toward authority.
It's interesting they shut it down around the time that Terence was and others were experimenting with morning glory seeds. And this goes back to this story that and we really have Rick Watson to thank for this and other stories that he shared with me. These are unpublished short stories, and he was an amazing writer in his own right. Um, then on top of that, he's also, you know, one of the characters in his story happens to be Terence. And this one story that he wrote called Morning Glory, that I document this story in the book, which was, as I said before, was an experience with Morning Glory seeds that they had in 1964. I believe it was the early 64. It could have even been late 63, but it was probably 64. And the one of the significant things about this story is that they were introduced to um, the process and the sourcing and the process the administration method and all of that by a scientist that showed up at a night science class that they both went
Right.
to,
Who
who
got to
was a
be
figure
Jim
who
Fadiman.
was a PhD student at that stage, who, as it turns out, as you say, was James Fadiman.
Mhm.
And Rick and I approached James about this, and he had no recollection, but he couldn't deny the details. He said it had to have been him, and he was quite astounded and pleasantly surprised. And I guess it's somewhat ironic that a figure who has become such a spokesperson for microdosing
Mhm.
was essentially responsible for Terence's first trip. Like,
Yes.
Terence being you know, the heroic doser.
Yeah. So that's interesting because, yeah, Jim is still very much in the loop and doing this microdosing thing, which probably Terence would scoff at, you know. I mean, I tend to scoff at it too. I sometimes say, well, you know, you could microdose, that's fine, but you shouldn't forget that just around the corner is a world of wonder. And you should take a look around the corner once in a while just to remind yourself what we're dealing with. But Jim is a very kind, very wonderful guy. And I've only met him a few times, but we've corresponded. And yeah, so one of the influences, one of the uh, mentors of Terence in a certain way provided he and Rick with just enough information that they could go out and do it for themselves. You know, that's an aspect of your biography. I don't think people realize how influential morning glory seeds were in their initial psychedelic experiences. That was their initial psychedelic experience. I never got very far with morning glories. You know, I tried it, obviously, being stuck back in Paonia, you know, and being 4 years behind Terence, but of course we were in touch, right? So everything Terence was doing, the little brother was trying to simulate too. So yeah, I went out, got morning glory seeds and took them, got, you know, unbelievably sick and had no other result from it, you know, but they turned out to be a pretty interesting a pretty interesting psychedelic, particularly the stronger ones, which we didn't know about at that time. Baby Hawaiian wood rose is, you know, a serious psychedelic. I'm surprised there's not more discussion of it, because it's quite pleasant at moderate doses, and it can be quite challenging at higher doses. So,
And it's interesting that the Rick, I recall, Rick and I had a lot of exchanges, and one of the things that he said that there was at a Walt High School around that time, there was some information circulating about morning glory seeds,
mhm,
and I'm not quite sure, but there may be a connection there with the demise of Neo Etudiant. There may have been a story in there. We don't know. I mean, maybe someone has these. I mean, they obviously had a very small circulation. So there may be. I mean, I did try to. I mean, you wouldn't believe the sorts of things I've tried to do, but I have spoken with various characters who were fellow students of Terence at that time, and John Parker and Rick Watson, um, who knew of that publication, which wasn't an Walt High School publication. It was a Los Altos publication.
right, right.
But I've yeah, I came up short of finding the smoking gun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. This stuff is hard to track down. Somewhere it's out there, and I think your suggestion that, yeah, they might have published something in Neo Etudiant, and that was just over the line for the faculty that was probably kind of loosely overseeing this. That was just a bridge too far, you know, and that was the end of it.
Now,
And
who's to say that someone else? I mean, as I say before, this is my biography is not the final word on Terence. If it inspires other people to dig further and excavate further, or provide, competing views, elaborate on various aspects of his life and relationships, or go deeper into his iconoclastic metaphysics, then my project will have served its purpose.
well, anyone who tries to excavate further and uncover things that you have not already discovered, they have a challenge because your work has been so thorough. and it's been obviously a labor of love, but a labor of excellent and remarkable scholarship, you know.
Thank you.
Uh,
I mean, there's been so many challenges along the way, and I don't, envy anyone going in there and going in deep. But I must say that uh, working through this over COVID was particularly important because I interacted with so many people who had a lot of time on their hands. And so it's quite fortuitous that I was actually living in one of the world's most locked down cities, which was Melbourne, uh, during that time, and fortuitous to have access to the internet and be in daily communications with dozens of people who may not have had and probably wouldn't have had the time to dig into their archives and so forth otherwise. So yeah, a strangely fortuitous set of circumstances, but ultimately hugely challenging project for a whole bunch of reasons that I outline in the preface.
yeah, yeah. It's been a real privilege to talk to you about this, and as we said earlier, we've barely scratched the surface. So I thank you for your time, and this. I hope this attracts a lot of interest in the book, and I'll do everything I can to make people aware of it. And we'll try to revisit this a couple more times before it launches. Uh, so we'll coordinate on that, and we'll keep our audience tuned. And and let's. I really appreciate your cooperation, and let's make this the book of the century. It needs to be recognized. Maybe not the book of the century, but
Yeah,
it
maybe
needs to
not, but I really appreciate your support, and thanks for having me on, and I relish the chatting about Terence with you, and look forward to our next jaunt.
me too. It is the definitive biography so far, as you said, the forward, maybe not comprehensive, but comprehensive enough, for the moment. So we'll leave it there, get some sleep. I will get on with
Thank
my
you, Dennis.
day, and I'll be in touch. Thank you so much, Graham.
All right,
So
bye
much
for now.
appreciated. So
See
much
see you see you
gratitude.
next time. All right, ciao.
Thank you.